Okay, so I just had a couple of quick announcements, and I don't think any of this applies to any of you guys, but remember we are creeping up on the 9 weeks, and so if you have any outstanding work, please be sure you've got about 10 days to get things in. So if you have anything that is not complete, please make sure within the next 10 days that you get those things turned in. And as we've been talking about, on your off days, whichever 2 days of the week that you're not here at school, you are able to come out on the bus or come to school on those days and then work in the lab if you just need a quiet place to work or access to a computer or printer. So those things are available if you just need time or help. So let us know, and we can talk further about that if you need that help. So, all right, well, I'm going to share my screen with you. And I threw this out on Moodle, and I've had this just as a printout just of information for probably 10 years, and I've read over it 100 times, and I finally have had time to turn it into a slideshow. And whenever I started working on this, I thought, there is just a ton of information on YouTube, for example, on how to make bread and the different kinds of bread, and then even like mistakes with bread, or what do I do if this happened to my bread, how do I fix it? And there's even some artistic applications, some artisan breads, and ways that people cut their bread so that it gets a pretty design on top. And oh my goodness, you could just spend forever just on YouTube, just watching people make different kinds of bread. So I definitely, since we've been working on this unit, I definitely have a new appreciation for all of the beautiful breads and loaves and all of the different grains and types of things that bread is made from, and then all of the bakers with their creativity and just the patience it takes to work through perfecting a recipe and trying different things, and it's just fun. And so I hope that you guys can come to appreciate that as well. But this is kind of a rough outline of kind of the history of bread. And so this is there's bread has just been around. One of the videos I watched said they have evidence of like 30,000 years ago of some type of bread. People used to just kind of mix it up like we'd mix up oatmeal, but they would eat it cold and just kind of let it set. But they found that if they let that set for a while, it would start to ferment, and then they would make a drink, and that's actually where beer came from. And they could also bake it, and they could have bread, or if they put it in the fire. And so, if you think about that staple of grains, that's been with humans probably since the beginning. And so which brings us to the profession of being a baker, which is probably one of the oldest trades anywhere. But there are lots of museums that have evidence of different types of loaves that were prepared, and different kinds of ovens have been discovered. And so I think it's interesting to notice that as a human, our love of grain and the things that we can do with it, I think is pretty amazing. And the different kinds of grains, I mean, if you go, you can really see lots of different kinds. If you go to like a Whole Food store that has big displays of all different kinds of grains. Some grains like amaranth, for instance, those are ancient grains. There's all kinds of of every kind of wheat that you could imagine. And then there are even different types of oats, and I mean, just amazing the variety of different kinds of grains that we can make blends with or make bread from. And so each one of those has a different color and a different texture, and it's just fascinating to play around with all of that. Okay, so I thought this was an interesting quote. When a food which would keep in the winter months could be multiplied in summer, it is said that civilization began. And so man began to realize that we could plan ahead for hard times or plan ahead for winter. You know, in the summertime when the grasses were plentiful, we can store those up for times whenever there's not much growing. And I thought that was, you know, the realization of the seasons and how things grow, and just how we began to learn that, you know, we could keep this and it would benefit us later. It's kind of just a good lesson, and maybe saving up for a rainy day kind of a thing. But I really, that kind of was interesting to me, that particular thought. Okay, so one thing that if you study the history of bread, one of the things that you're going to find is there's a baker's guild, and that is been around a very, very long time. And we would think of those as maybe today as professional organizations. But back in this particular time, it was a lot more serious than that. These were professions, and they didn't just let anybody join. You had to be born into the profession, meaning that your parent was in that profession, and then your children learned that, and then were brought up in that particular profession, and they couldn't just quit if they didn't like it. They were there. But when we explore this, we find that the bakers were really the only types of craftsmen that were free men. All of the other types of trades, those were slaves, and those people were forced to do that work. And so it was a much different situation. But bakers, they enjoyed special privileges because of what they were providing for the people. And it is pretty interesting how that worked. So some of the things that they had to observe was members of the baking guild. They couldn't mix with comedians or gladiators in the Colosseum, and they couldn't go to the amphitheater. So if you think about ancient Rome, you know, that was a huge part of their life of entertainment and social, was going to the games and being entertained by theater productions. And the thought was that they might be contaminated by vices of ordinary people. And so they really tried to, you know, the things that happen with bread, how the bread rose and how all of those different things was almost kind of magical. And so they kind of associated that particular skill with the people, and they didn't want that to seem too common. And so they were kind of kept away from some of the daily activities. But we did find in Pompeii, you know, that's the city where the volcano erupted and everything was just covered in lava, and it was all just kind of preserved in time. And as the archaeologists began to uncover that, they found bakeries there, and we learned that the bakeries were actually opened to the public because not all people had an oven in their house. They would just make the loaves at home and then take them to the bakery to be baked. And some places you could even buy loaves of bread there, which I guess is the precursor to our modern day bakery, where you can buy baked goods. Okay, and here's kind of an example of Roman bread, or what we discovered when we were unearthing things in Pompeii. And see the cuts on the top of that bread, and so those are relief cuts. Whereas, you know, as it starts to bake in the oven, it will tear otherwise. And so if you make cuts in the bread, it makes a pleasing design and will split along the design, as opposed to just tearing or even exploding in the oven. But the Romans were quite industrious bakers, and were very good at it, and had lots and lots of different kinds of bread. And some of the breads were particularly lovely with milk and eggs and butter. And so obviously those are going to be for the wealthy people, and wouldn't be just for just everybody. Not everybody could afford those. But there were, if you want to learn more about that, there was an ancient Egyptian grammarian who has all kinds of theories about bread baking. And you can look this fellow up, Anathias, and check that out. Okay, so in biblical times, if you remember your Bible history, remember whenever the Israelites were released from Egypt, they were unable to let their bread rise as usual, and so they ate unleavened bread. Do you remember that story? And so on Passover, that is something that is a Jewish custom, for instance, to eat unleavened bread, which means the leaven means that it didn't have time to rise. And but we'll see, we didn't really have what we have now in the form of yeast. They had something called barm, which I would liken to probably like our sourdough starter, which would be something kind of like that. And they could, a lot of times they would just save part of the dough from the day before when they made bread, and then it would leaven the next loaf. And so there's always that ongoing ferment, so that the bread would rise. Okay, so on to kind of early England. So as we begin to have lots more people, we begin to have food shortages, and then sometimes there would be a crop failure and things like that. Well, the king and the people of wealth knew that if the common man could not buy food, there would be rebellion. And so they worked really hard to regulate the price of loaves of bread, and had a fixed cost for wheat that the bakers would buy, and how much profit they could make on a loaf of bread. And like I told you earlier, there's lots of different kinds of wheat and bread. And during this time, those heavy, dark loaves were considered less desirable, and so they were also less expensive, and the people of wealth wanted a nice white loaf. And so, but those were people that were of wealth that could afford a more expensive loaf. But the white loaves were made from hand ground, finely ground grain, whereas the dark loaves, they were much more heavily grained. Okay, so this article I thought was neat. It talks about how much things cost. And in 1266, there was a law that allowed a baker to make a 12 pence for each quarter of wheat that he made into bread. And so I would be curious to know how much bread that 60 pounds of wheat made. But if you think about, I don't know, the loaf that we're making, are you using 2 cups of flour in that, guys? Do you remember? About 2 cups, maybe? And so 2 cups is about a poundish. And so, you know, you can kind of do a little math there. We could probably work that out. But just to make it interesting, you know, master carpenter was paid 2/5 of a shilling per day. So bakers earned quite a bit less than a carpenter, uh, because they could work every day. They weren't dependent on the weather. You know, if it's raining, you know, a carpenter probably couldn't work very well outside, and so the baker had more opportunity to make money. But just, you know, a shilling today is worth about 6 cents. But of course, back in this time, that would have been, you know, a much larger sum of money. But I thought that was interesting that they had gone to that much detail on how much money, you know, set a ceiling on how much money a baker could make. But when you think about the types of food that were available to people, you know, they had meat if they could catch an animal. And, you know, folks that were poor people or folks that were servants during that time, all of the animals belonged to the landowner or the king. And so unless it was given to them meat-wise, they had very little. And the same thing with all of the grains and the things that were growing. If they weren't able to just find it, they had very little that they were able to eat. So it made it very difficult for them to have enough food. Okay, so back to the guild. In early England, they were very specific and very exclusive, the people that belonged to the guilds, and they didn't like it if someone outside of the guild decided to make bread. As an apprentice, you had to serve an apprenticeship of 7 years before you could be a baker. There were bread examiners, and if your loaves were found to be underweight, you could get in a great deal of trouble, fined, or punished in other ways. Or if you were using an inferior product, you could also be in a great deal of trouble. So sometimes they would bake in coins or bake in something that had some weight to it to affect the loaf of the bread. I don't know how they thought they would get away with that, because it would bake in there, but anyway, it happened, but not too often, because like I said, there was a bread examiner and eventually they would be found out. Okay, and some of the guilds, like I said, they are alive and well, and again, now they are more of a professional organization, offering training and fellowship and support of the particular craft. But it's a pretty interesting history of where that all came from. Okay, the invention of the steam engine changed life as we knew it pre-existing. You know, they either had an animal drawn grindstone that would grind the wheat, or it might have been a windmill, or it might have been a water wheel. But those grindstones were turned by whatever method that they had when they would put the wheat in, and the grindstone would roll over that, and then the ground wheat would pour out. But as time went on, someone invented the steam engine, and at that point they were able to grind wheat much finer and much faster. And that brought bread to the masses. So for the first time, they were able to do it on a large scale. You know, bakers were a pretty stubborn lot, though, and it took them a little while for the steam engine method to catch on, but once it did, they never looked back. Okay, so and kind of fast forward a little bit to the World War I. You know, I think Napoleon is credited with saying something to the effect, "An army marches on its stomach." But if you think about, you know, the need for food and bread, and you know, if those resources are cut off, you know, an army in a country would not last very long. And so there were lots of regulations within here in the States that um, that that we were conserving things and we were doing experiments. I thought this was interesting down here. Substitutes for wheat, peas and arrowroot and parsnips and beans and lentils. I mean, we're doing that now, but it's kind of by choice, trying to come up with different artisan recipes, but coming up with different ways to make bread minus the wheat. And you think about like food supply ships. You know, if those are sunk before they get to the troops, that could be very detrimental to the success of their campaign if they don't have food. And so those are some things that were realized during this time. Okay, World War II, again, those same regulations, and we were really beginning to kind of relive the things as before, and we know that how important food is and the ability to get that into places where people need it. Okay, so in a little bit about yeast. Okay, so in the early days, we would get it from a brewer. So from making a beer, and now we just buy commercial yeast. It's just available just about anywhere, and it is actually a byproduct of whiskey distillers. And yeast is a live. It's a plant. It's live, and it is capable of reproducing itself. Okay, and as we learned from our sourdough experiment, we grow it by feeding it sugar and flour, or we can kill it by starving it or by heat, right, when we put it in the oven. But the big deal with the yeast is it supplies carbon dioxide into the dough mixture, and it causes it to bubble, and that's what inflates the dough, kind of blows it up like a balloon, and that's what makes our bread nice and tender and puffy. Okay, so yeast, that ferment action while it's growing, it is also flavoring the dough, and so the longer that we can allow that to happen, the more flavorful our dough is going to be. Right, and this is just kind of a picture of a kernel of wheat. Sometimes you'll see wheat referred to as a wheat berry. Okay, and there are three separate parts that are contained in this wheat berry, and that's the endosperm, and that's the majority of the kernel of wheat, and that's what we make white flour with. And then you probably heard of wheat bran, haven't you? Like the bran flakes in cereal, and it's a much smaller percent of the kernel of wheat, and that is actually pulled off whenever we are grinding the wheat, and it's separated out. And then also the wheat germ, and you probably also heard of wheat germ before because you can buy it in a jar. But a lot of times, like in whole wheat flour, you'll see like the germ is added back in. One of the things, if you are keeping flour around, you'll notice that your whole wheat flour doesn't last as long, or it'll turn rancid faster than white flour, and that has to do with the fat that is in the germ. And so, but our nice silky white flour has the bran and the germ removed, and that's why it's white. And whenever you think about like whole wheat flour, that has not been removed, and so it's a much darker color, and it's also the texture of it is a little more grainy as opposed to that silky smooth white flour. Right, and then again, here's that wheat berry, kind of just more of a close up there. Okay, and we're calling it, they look like seeds, but they actually are true fruits, and we're calling it a berry. And is rich obviously in carbohydrates, but we know it has protein, there's B vitamins, and calcium. So, and I think bread kind of gets a bad rap sometimes. I mean, everybody's been kind of anti-carb lately. Have you been hearing that in the news? Yeah, yeah. And I think we have done a lot of not good things to some of our grains. We have modified them in a lot of ways, or we've added Roundup to the grains so that we don't have to worry about weeds in the pasture. And we've done a lot of well, monkeying around with things that maybe we shouldn't have been doing. And then white bread and white Wonder Bread is hardly bread at all. When once you look at an artisan loaf. And but going back to original bread and organic wheat, those types of things, I can't help but think that those would have to be healthy for us and good for us, because it's been a staple with us since the beginning of time. And so I think some of the things probably that we've done to it have been really unfortunate. But bread, in it as it was intended, I think has got to be a very good thing. Yeah. What do you guys think?
I think, like with all this like low carb stuff, I think that's, in moderation, I think everything is okay. I mean, like you said, bread's been around since the beginning of time, and, but sometimes we kind of overindulge, and maybe that's where the problem is.
It's true. It's true. Too much of a good thing is too much, maybe. Well, guys, there's a couple of videos. Well, I put this slideshow, excuse me, on Moodle, but there's a couple of other slideshows that I found perusing whenever I was looking out on YouTube. If you're interested, you surely don't have to look, but if you're interested, there's kind of a funny one that is called Bread, the History and Laughing Historically. That's kind of a fun one. Bread, the History, and that's Laughing Historically. And then I ran across another one that was, it's this guy that is, it's a show by the BBC, but he's a baker, and he has been entering a contest, and he's in search of the perfect loaf of bread, and that's what it's called, In Search of the Perfect Loaf. And it's it says BBC 4. And that one was interesting to watch the different trials that this guy went through. And it shows him, in the process of making bread, and his dough is sticky. We always think we've got to add more flour to keep it from being so sticky. Well, the more flour you add, the tougher it's going to get too. And so I had an interesting time. I was very interested rather in watching his process. And so I thought it would be a good one. And the other one, if you want to, I'm always fascinated by the artisan loaves. Like if you go into a bakery and you see the beautiful loaves where they've been cut and they just look like flowers and snowflakes and leaves. And it's just so artistic. Well, I watched a show, it's How to Score Sourdough Bread. And this lady uses a razor blade, and she starts off making cuts that look like wheat, and then she makes it into a flour, and it's useful too, in that, you can score it just so that it doesn't tear or explode. But if you cut it, it will relieve in a beautiful design. But it's called How to Score Sourdough Bread, and it's Bread Journey. But anyway, it was interesting how she decorated the tops of the loaves. So if you have a minute or an interest, encourage you to get on there and look. So I don't have an assignment for you this week, but next time you're here, we're going to be making focaccia bread. So, and you know, focaccia is kind of a cousin to pizza, and it has kind of a little bit puffier than typical pizza dough, and it has some lovely toppings that we'll put on it. And then, of course, we'd have to also make our lovely rich dough, and I thought we could make some cinnamon rolls. So we'll be doing that next. So I hope you all will enjoy that. So I'm gonna stop recording here.